Power. Okay, can you all see my screen okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's funny, I've actually just finished recording a podcast for the Common Grounds Unity group, all about deconstruction, and people who are quote unquote deconstructing their faith. And for me, deconstruction and rethinking is not something that I do to sort of fix a problem so I can sort of begin my life. Deconstruction for me is always going on. I'm not just sort of rethinking the Bible for the sake of this Bible discussion, and it's not just something I do with some destination in mind. I'm always rethinking the Bible, and part of what I want to try to get across today is why I think that matters. And I mean, hopefully that will come across. I'll use one sort of set of passages as a test case, but I don't really have an agenda for where this discussion will go. People can raise whatever they want to raise, but that's really where I'm coming from. Now, I agree with John Barton that the Bible has become part of the shared intellectual culture of the West. Most people quote the Bible without even knowing that they're doing it. If you've ever said that, a leopard never changed its spots, or so-and-so has fallen on his sword, you're quoting the Bible, even if you don't know it. And it's become part of how we interact with the world. And that, as I say, it's different for different people. For Richard Dawkins, the Bible it's not systematically evil, but it's just plain weird, as you'd expect from a chaotically cobbled together anthology of disjointed documents, composed, revised, translated, distorted, and improved by hundreds of anonymous authors, editors, and copyists, unknown to us and mostly unknown to each other, spanning 9 centuries. I was having a discussion about this very briefly at a British New Testament conference a few years ago, and people were saying this is why you shouldn't allow biblical studies in the hands of just about anybody, because this is the kind of level of engagement that you get, and that's coming from someone who actually I actually appreciate a lot of Richard Dawkins' scholarship, although this conclusion is pretty off the mark. But anyway, old Blue Eyes said that alcohol may be man's worst enemy, but the Bible says love your enemy. Depending on who you are, you will have a different view of what the Bible is and what the Bible isn't. So I want to start by saying a few things about what I think the Bible is not. I don't think the Bible is a list of dogma. When people use the phrase in very well-meaning fashion that I put the Bible into practice, I often wonder what that means. You read the book of Numbers and then you put it into practice. I don't know what that means. Even if you read the Gospels, what does it mean to put it into practice? Most of the Gospels are not commands or a list of things to do. It's mostly narrative. It's mostly a story about Jesus. Unfortunately, the Bible has been used to try to get people to do things. It was used to control slaves. It's used to control even so-called free people, to the point where they don't feel free in certain communities. Whilst the Bible does help in the way that we interact with the world, I don't think it's primarily a self-help book. And I think that idea gets hijacked by people with all sorts of agendas, not least of all prosperity preachers, and all kinds of sort of Instagram panhandlers and goodness knows who else. I wouldn't even necessarily say that the Bible is a guide for improved spirituality. When people have this sort of a view, what they're normally doing is just taking the bits of the Bible which, tally with whatever view they already happen to hold, and discard the other bits. Now, I'm not even necessarily saying that's a bad practice. I just don't think that's why the ancient communities brought these texts together. Nor do I think it's wise to approach the Bible looking for scientific truth and other kinds of sort of empirical scientific ideas or other kinds of empirical truths. When I say that I think the Bible has the truth, it's a particular kind of truth I'm talking about, and that's something which needs explored. So much for what I think the Bible is not. let's get on to what the Bible is, because this will be kind of the foundation of how I explore the handful of texts I want to look at. I do think the Bible is primarily a narrative. It's a story. It's a story about God's desire to have a relationship with his creation, how that went wrong, and how he took the initiative to put it right. It's not like the deists believe that God kind of switched the world on and then went off for a coffee whilst we sort of try to fix the mess. And, you know, nor is it like the spiritualists believe, where we all look within for the answers, but rather it's a story about God taking the initiative to repair what was broken in the relationship with the entire creation, and about man's role in that. And, you know, I think Paul puts it wonderfully in Romans 8, when he says that the entire creation is in groaning, waiting for the revelation of the sons of God, that we are all, as God's people, a part of that restoration process. I also think the Bible is a library. It's not a book, it's a collection of books. In that part, by the way, Richard Dawkins is right. He puts it in horribly negative, pejorative and patronizing fashion, but he's true. That was written over several centuries, and it's a number of different texts written by people who probably didn't know each other and didn't necessarily agree with each other. This is one thing which I think sometimes we attempt to flatten out these tensions. This is part of what I'm going to talk about in a moment. And I think we lose part of the overall message of this great meta-narrative because we try to make it all tally. I do think the Bible is contextual. It has to be understood in a number of contextual moments. Firstly, the moment of the author himself or herself. They're writing because of a particular situation, and they're writing to address that situation. They're writing because of a particular desire to convey some story, and they themselves have their own challenges, their own government, their own political and cultural context that they're writing from. Then there's the finished text itself. You know, now the text is out of the hands of the author, but it's in the hands of anybody, and the text itself creates a world. Part of the biblical world is the world that the text itself creates, because we try to build a picture. Just take any of Paul's letters. We only have Paul's side of the conversation. He's in argument in Galatians with some Jewish Christians who think that Gentiles need to embrace Jewish culture in order to be the people of God. But we never hear from them. All we hear is Paul's version of what they believe, and that's how we build the story. So the text itself as a finished product is part of where the word, the context comes from. Context actually emerges from the text and the author, but then it also emerges from the reader themselves, and we have to see this dialectic in operation. And we ourselves bring all kinds of baggage. We've seen this in all sorts of ways, even, you know, over the last few years. People going through COVID bring that to the Bible. People who have sort of latched onto Black Lives Matter in the wake of the murder of George Floyd bring a whole load of particular questions to the Bible about justice, fairness, equality, race, all these sorts of things. But also, I think not only is that the case, but the Bible is not just a mix of different genres. We can all acknowledge that, yes, there's poetry, and yes, there's law, and yes, there's, you know, gospel, and there's wisdom literature and all these different things. But even within a particular text, you know, Revelation is apocalyptic literature. But in chapters 2 and 3, there are 7 epistles. And then the book begins by saying a book of the prophecy. So we've got prophecy, epistle, and apocalyptic all in this one book. So even within a book, there's a complex mixture of genres at play. But we have to allow those genres to rub against each other and allow them to kind of have their voice. So what does this all kind of add up to then? How then ought this to make us rethink things? And I simply say this is, as I say, I'm always rethinking the Bible, and I would encourage all people to be constantly rethinking the Bible. I think for our purposes today, part of what I want to try to convey is that the Bible is incredibly sophisticated literature in one sense. In another sense, you don't need a theology degree to understand it and to understand what it means to have a relationship with God. But we have to allow it to breathe. And if we do that, I actually think we get some of its deeper truths, which we miss when we have this view of what the Bible is supposed to be. So how can we, in some sense, free the Bible from those shackles? And don't get me wrong, I'm not claiming this is the only way to do it. I'm not even claiming it's the best way to do it. I'm just saying it's part of what's helped me in my quest over the years. So I want to take the example of a fairly well-known story in the Gospels. It's one which is clearly intended to be historical. I remember Ed Sanders writing this in his little book on Jesus in the, I think it's in the Routledge series. And Ed Sanders describes himself as a thoroughly secularized Protestant, but this is not your sort of card-carrying biblical fundamentalist by any stretch of the imagination. And he has a list of 10 or so irrefutable or fairly irrefutable facts about the historical Jesus. And that he caused some commotion in the temple is one of the things which even someone who's not a quote unquote, someone sort of believer in the Bible would say this incident clearly happened. However, the version of the story that we get in the Synoptics is actually quite different from the version of the story that we get in John. And as we think about what we do with that, hopefully some things will come to light. Now, my purpose here today, and hopefully this will generate some discussion, is fairly simple. Some will look at this and say, aha, a bunch of contradictions in the Bible, throw the whole Bible away. Others would say, well, one of them is lying to us, and the purpose of this kind of study is to work out which. And these things, I think, all make a whole bunch of assumptions about the Bible, which all miss the point. So here are some differences. I don't need to go through all these, but you can see clearly, and I'll talk through some of these, that the differences between John's presentation of that commotion that Jesus caused in the temple in Jerusalem and the version that you get in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The version in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is not exactly the same, but they're all much closer. Contextually, they're different, again, as we'll see briefly in a moment, but they tell basically the same story. John, the actual details of the cleansing itself don't seem too dissimilar, but contextually and in the details, as you can see, it's a world away. Most notably, John puts it at the beginning of Jesus's ministry, whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem to place it as the most proximate cause for Jesus's arrest at the end of his ministry. And, you know, people have tried to claim, I remember the famous evangelical preacher of the sort of 19th century, Matthew Henry, claimed that Jesus must have done it twice, which I think makes a mockery of the historical core of the biblical text. But what's going on here? Well, John has it, you know, just after this miracle of turning water into wine, which the Synoptics don't mention. They put it just after Jesus's so-called triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Jesus claims that he's going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, and John says actually he's talking about the resurrection. The Synoptic authors don't mention that. Interestingly, in the trial scenes in the Synoptic Gospels, they do mention some threat about Jesus claiming to destroy the temple. Whether it's this threat or another one, we don't know. But they don't actually mention the threat itself. The Synoptics link it to these two biblical passages in Isaiah and Jeremiah, whereas John links it to the 69th Psalm. And as I said, yeah, there's no threat made in the Synoptic Gospels in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but there is this threat made in John. Okay, what's going on here? All right. Again, this is just kind of one way of looking at things. First of all, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through all these 4 things to try to explain what I think the Bible is with using this example. So it's a story, it's a library, it's contextual, it's multi-layered, and we'll see all 4 of these things. First of all, it is part of the story of the Gospels, and therefore part of the broader narrative. Jesus was, amongst other things, a prophet, and prophets routinely performed what I often refer to as acted parables. There are other ways of talking about these things, but like in Isaiah 20, him walking around naked in order to make a comment about the judgment against Egypt and Ethiopia, and about how the rise of Assyrian rule. And of course, eventually the Assyrians took over the northern kingdom of Israel as well. But God was trying to say, look, Assyria is a rising power, and if my people don't repent, they're going to be trouble. And he says first it's going to happen to Egypt and to Ethiopia, Cush, and they're going to be led away naked as captives, just like Isaiah is walking around naked and barefoot now for 3 years. So pretty sort of ghastly thing Isaiah had to do. Hosea had to marry a prostitute, these crazy things that the prophets were called to do as acted parables of something which God was trying to say to his people. Well, I put it I take Jesus's action in the temple in the same way, that this was some way Jesus enacting some aspect of God's story. Now, what John thinks he was enacting and what Matthew, Mark, and Luke thinks he was enacting are different, but I think they're completely complementary. And in my view, actually make the entire story more powerful. And I think you lose that power when you try and sort of unnaturally reconcile these stories, which are clearly very different in their details. For John, and this is entirely in line with his broader contextual themes, John describes Jesus as something which was going to replace the temple. Jesus is the new temple in John 2:21. He says he wasn't talking about the actual temple when he said he was going to destroy it. And they said, look, mate, this took 46 years to build, and we're going to rebuild it in 3 days. John tells us he was talking about the temple of his body. And that's precisely in line with everything else John says about Jesus, because John wants us to know that Jesus is the presence of God on earth. He is the word made flesh, John 1:1, John 1:14. He is the manna that's come from heaven. He's God's provision, in John 6, based on Exodus 16. He is the true shepherd, drawing both on the 23rd Psalm and on Ezekiel 34. He's the true vine. In the scriptures, Israel was the true vine, and God would interact with Israel. But for John, Jesus is the real vine. Here's where heaven and earth meet. That comes even more powerfully in John 1:51, where John describes, or has Jesus saying to Nathanael, truly, I say to you, you'll see heaven opened, the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. It's exactly how Jacob described that great ladder in Genesis 28 in his dream, so-called Jacob's ladder, the thing that connected heaven and earth. Because for John, Jesus connects heaven and earth. He's that place where God's fullness dwells. He's the place where humanity and divinity collide in this powerful, loving fashion. But for the synoptics, it's quite a different part of the story. And they're even quite different in themselves in this respect. Mark has the story of the temple in between the two halves of the cursing of the fig tree. Because just like Jesus cursed the fig tree and it withered, he pronounced judgment on the temple. And of course, 30 or so years later, 40 or so years later, the temple itself was destroyed by Titus's armies. Matthew has the temple cleansing, and then he has Jesus healing in the temple, and kids are shouting out Hosanna, and Jesus, he cites Psalm 8:2, that from the mouth of children I've ordained praise. Well, who of course has ordained praise? It's actually God who's ordained praise. And then the chief priests ask, by what authority are you doing these things? Who the heck pronounces judgment on the temple? Who heals in the temple? Who quotes Psalm 8:2 and relates it to themselves? Who do you think you are? That's pretty messianic stuff to do. What are you saying? So for Matthew, the temple cleansing is actually about Jesus's authority. It's about his role as the Messiah to perform these duties. And Luke has the story right after Jesus has come into Jerusalem and he's weeping over Jerusalem. And he tells a story about, how I'd love as a chick covers her young, or a hen covers her young, would like to sort of wrap my arms around Jerusalem, and yet this is the state that Jerusalem's in. And Luke tells us that he's there teaching every day, and then cleanses the temple. For Luke, it's very much about prophecy. It's very much linked to Matthew and Mark. It is a prophecy about judgment, and it is. He does have that connection with authority. The chief priests and elders ask the same question in Luke 20 verse 2 as they ask in Matthew 21 verse 23. But it's very much about the prophetic claim. So yes, there's a story here, but two very different, and as we'll see in a moment, towards the end, complementary stories, but different stories nonetheless. Now, the Bible is a library. The early church clearly had no problem with this apparent discrepancy between the synoptic portrayal of the temple cleansing and the Johannine version of temple cleansing. They saw them as complementary stories. If you see the patristic, now some of the church fathers did the Matthew Henry thing and tried to reconcile things. Let's not pretend that they didn't. But they certainly had no problem, these texts lying side by side. Our lives as gospel interpreters would be much easier if there was just one gospel. This is part of why I think Uthman destroyed all the variant readings of the Quran during Uthman's caliphate. So when Muslims say, oh, there's one Quran, they're absolutely right. It's a standardized version, but that's because all the variant versions were burned. Now, there are still hints of the variant readings. We still can see those in the standardized version, in the sort of textual notes and things. But the church seemed to didn't have this concern. Not only do the variant readings of the Bible still exist, but there are sort of apocryphal texts which still exist. It's likely that some regimes tried to destroy them, but they still exist. But they clearly had no problem within the canon itself putting John's version of Jesus's story alongside the synoptics Matthew, Mark, and Luke, even though until you get to the last 2 weeks of Jesus's life, John's version of the story is wildly different. There's hardly any of John's material is in the synoptics, and very little of the synoptic material is in John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have Jesus waxing lyrical about the kingdom of God. John has Jesus waxing lyrical about himself in these lengthy speeches that you get. So the texts must be allowed to breathe. They must be allowed to speak individually. But our job is not to make them all say the same thing, but to say what is their message and how does it complement, how does one message complement the other, and even how do they clash and what can we learn from those tensions. But that brings us to the context. And I think the best way of looking at this is how they've quoted the Hebrew Bible. So in John's version of the temple cleansing, he likens it to Psalm 69. Now, one thing I've learned from Richard Hayes, who I spent time with actually in March, that was an incredible time. But one of his big contributions to intertextuality and the use of the Hebrew Bible in the New Testament is we've got to think about the entire context of the bit that's being quoted, not just the quote itself. So one thing that definitely occurred to me was that John isn't just thinking about Psalm 69 verse 9, which he quotes. So when Jesus cleanses the temple, the apostles say, oh, remember what he said, zeal for your house has consumed me. Well, that's a quote from Psalm 69. What's interesting is that Psalm 69 appears elsewhere in John. He quotes Psalm 69 verse 4, in John 15 verse 5, those who hated me without a cause are more than the hairs of my head. And then that bit, which actually appears in the other Gospels as well, about when they gave Jesus this gall to drink to try to sort of ease the pain of the crucifixion. Again, it's actually a quote from Psalm 69:21. So John, for him, the context of the temple cleansing is Psalm 69. So when you read Psalm 69, we think, well, why? What's going on in Psalm 69? Well, Psalm 69 is all about David being consumed. Now, when he says zeal for your house, he doesn't mean the temple. He means the house of David. His zeal for the house of David, because of his zeal for the house of David, which God had established, we read about that in 2 Samuel 7, he endures all the scorn of his enemies. And of course, David's being hunted down by Absalom and others. And he endures all of that because of his passion for the house of David. John picks up on this house language, and for him, the house is the temple. He transposes that to the temple. And for him, just like David's house was established by God and represents God, the temple was established by God and represents God. So if Jesus now is placing himself right in the center of that, what's John saying? That John is the true place where God exists, where God reigns and God rules and God's presence is felt. Just like the temple and just like David's monarchy, Jesus is now the fulcrum of God's presence. He's the true representative of the house of David, i.e. the Messiah. He's the true temple, the place where God's presence is known and felt. The synoptics quote two passages, Isaiah 56 verse 7 and Jeremiah 7:11. Well, what's Isaiah 56 all about? Well, the quote is, "My house will be called a prayer for all peoples," or all nations, as some texts say. But the entire passage of Isaiah 56 is all about how Gentiles will have their place in amongst God's people. And not just Gentiles. Earlier on in the story, it's not just foreigners, it talks about eunuchs, right? The author of Acts 8 is clearly drawing on Isaiah 56 as well, because here you've got foreigners and eunuchs. And of course, you have this Ethiopian eunuch, a foreign eunuch, joining the house of God in Acts chapter 8. But the synoptic authors were thinking this. They're thinking that they're drawing upon Isaiah 56, which says that foreigners who join themselves to the Lord and hold firmly to the covenant, even those I'll bring to my holy mountain. In other words, he's saying, I'll bring them to the temple. I'll bring them to this so-called house of prayer, which is the temple. Sorry, that's what I've just said here. So what's the issue here? Well, for the authors of the New Testament, of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when the money changers were there, and of course they're in the Gentile court, they're obstructing the area the Gentiles come to worship, they are doing the exact opposite. So Isaiah is saying, the divine voice in Isaiah is saying that there'll be this place in the temple where even the Gentiles will come to worship me. And now here are all these people obstructing the Gentile courts, keeping the Gentiles out. And then they quote Jeremiah 7 verses 8. Well, they quote verse 11, which says that the house, that is the temple, has become this den of robbers. And again, if you read the entire Jeremiah 7, which is a really sort of powerful oracle of judgment, Jeremiah's talking about a bunch of Jewish people who come to the temple, even though they're guilty of gross sin, the kind of gross idolatry and marginalization of the poor and the vulnerable, which led to the deportation to Babylon. And then they go and worship in the temple. This was something which, we read it in Amos 5, when he said, I can't stand your assemblies. I hate your religious gatherings. Again, we see the same thing in Isaiah chapter 1, when people do all this religious stuff, when they're rotten to the core and oppressing widows and orphans and this sort of thing. And so the temple is like this hideout, this place where you can come and feel religious and almost feel as if God's going to overlook all this horrible stuff you've been doing. Well, again, it's the same point that Jesus is making. Jesus's judgment on the temple was an indictment. It was a judgment of the coming destruction of the temple. And why was the temple going to be destroyed? Well, because in the same way as in Jeremiah's context, there were people, Jewish rebels, hiding out in the temple. They were off killing Romans and killing even Jews they thought were defectors, and then hiding out in the temple. And he's thinking, again, this is an abuse of what God built the temple, allowed the temple to be built for in the first place. Bringing those two things together, I see something really powerful happening. The temple, according to the way the synoptic authors used the Old Testament, was meant to be the temple had become this monument to exclusivity. It's where the Gentiles were being shut off, according to Isaiah 56, and a place where rebellious Jews who weren't obeying God, but came there to feel holy and religious, even though they were doing terrible things, were hiding out. And the destruction of the temple was God's judgment on that kind of arrogance, because the temple was meant to be a place for all people, irrespective of their ethnic origin. It wasn't a place of exclusivity, and it wasn't a monument to a particular ethnic group or ethnic understanding. Just like Paul says in Romans 3:29, is God the God of the Jews only? No, he's God of the Gentiles also. God's meant to throw the doors open to everyone. So there's both continuity and difference between the synoptic account of John, of the temple cleansing, you see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John's account. They're different in the details, they're different in the emphases. For John, Jesus is the place of divine presence. But for the synoptic authors, for Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the temple represents the universality of that presence. It's not just a presence for the elect people, it's a presence for all people. And so we see that those two ideas crescendoing in the different accounts. So, done a lot of babbling. What do I think we should take away? Firstly, before the Bible is something that we quote unquote put into practice or look for things to obey or whatever, the Bible is the narrative. It's a story of God's relationship with human beings. And if that's the context within which we understand what the biblical authors were trying to get at, we're much more likely to allow the texts to breathe, to not try and flatten out the differences or flatten out the tensions, but ask, what does each author in their own context, at their own time, and for their own reasons have to say, and how does it contribute to this broader story of why God created people and why he values his relationship with them. But secondly, as we've seen, it's not just a rote history of events. The story that John tells in terms of history as we understand history as kind of empirical facts, and this happened and then that happened and then this happened, it's not historical. Now, my guess, and I think most gospel scholars would take this, and I'm not a gospel scholar, by the way, but most gospel scholars would take this view, that Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell the version that we would call history. They tell the version as it actually happened. John takes the story, he takes the story of what actually happened, Jesus' clearing of the temple, and plonks it into a completely different context, and does so unapologetically. And we don't turn around to John and say, well, how dare you? And what do you think you're playing at? Clearly, Jesus gave the apostles carte blanche. Well, not quite carte blanche, but he certainly gave them the authority to tell his story. We read about Peter being given the keys of the kingdom, and what you bind on earth will be bound, etc. The authors of the New Testament, the people who knew Jesus personally or knew the apostles personally, those who were with Jesus, had the right to tell this story in a way that brought that explained this great enterprise of God to restore his relationship with humanity in the way that they wanted. And that was not a way that necessarily coincides with modern 21st century Western views of history, of culture, of philosophy, or storytelling. In many ways, it breaks some of our rules and conventions, but we have to let the authors do that if we want their message to shine through. And when we do that, I think the message is doubly powerful and so much more refreshing and liberating, and gives us such a much more honest picture of God. The thing I say finally is that wherever there's confusion about this, our starting point must be Jesus. Again, I said this in the previous podcast, and I'll say it again because I think it's relevant. Unlike the Muslims claim, we are not al-Kitab. We're not people of the book. Now, maybe the Muslims are people of the book in the sense that Islam emerged from the Quran and from those revelations which they believe God gave to Muhammad. To some degree, the law had a very constitutionalizing effect on the elect people. So you could say they're the people of the book in that slightly looser sense. It's much more different, I think, today, where most Jews, it's rabbinic Judaism, which they follow, as opposed to Torah Judaism as such. But for Christians, it's completely untrue. There was people believing in Jesus long before there was something called the Bible. If we want to strictly go according to the 66 books that we call the Bible, well, that didn't exist till the middle of the 4th century and St. Athanasius's Festal Letter. But there were people believing in Jesus long before the Bible existed. Why? Because we're not the people of the book. We are a people of the person, Jesus. Our entire understanding of the story that we see in the Hebrew Bible has to be seen through Jesus's lens. That's what we see at the end of Luke 24, when he says to them that all the law and the prophets and the Psalms point to me. Well, how do they point to him? He says that they tell the story of his death and resurrection, what that would mean. Well, does it? I can't see that story anywhere in the Old Testament. The only way that story makes sense is through the lens of Jesus and what happened to Jesus on the cross and a few days after that. Okay, that's enough of my babbling. Let me stop sharing for a second. I'm happy to invite whatever questions these thoughts inspire. Nothing that I say today will be as meaningful as what you then go away and think about yourself. And that's what I would really encourage you to do. And I think you will, in deepening your grasp of the biblical texts and asking the kinds of questions that hopefully I've kind of raised in some way today, that your own apprehension of what it means that we are part of a great story will enrich your faith. Okay.